Mr. Chen shook his head. But you didn't. And because of that, hundreds of other students won't have to face what you faced. That's what real change looks like, not just fixing one problem, but creating a whole new way of doing things. As Alex packed up his books, he paused at his old desk in the back corner. Someone had carved a small message into its surface. Speak up. You're not alone. Walking home in the golden evening light, Alex thought about all the changes a single year had brought. The fear and isolation he'd felt seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by a sense of purpose and community. His story had become more than just a cautionary tale. It was a blueprint for positive change. At home, he found an envelope from the State Education Board. Inside was an invitation to join a student advisory panel on educational reform. They wanted his input on making mathematics education more inclusive and engaging for all students. As he sat at his desk that night, working on his latest educational game design, Alex smiled at how far things had come. The probability game that Mrs. Thompson had once dismissed now sat on teachers' desks across the district, helping students discover the joy of mathematics. But more importantly, it stood as a symbol of what was possible when people faced their biases, admitted their mistakes, and worked together to build something better. The story of the racist teacher hadn't ended with punishment. It had evolved into a story of transformation, not just for one person or one school, but for an entire community. And somewhere out there, another student might be gathering the courage to speak up, knowing that their voice could be the one to spark the next wave of positive change. 1 year later, Highland Grove Middle School had transformed in ways both visible and invisible. The hallways now displayed student artwork celebrating diverse cultures and achievements. Bulletin boards showcased mathematical concepts from various cultural perspectives. But the real change was in the atmosphere. The way students moved through the school with confidence, the way teachers engaged with every student as an individual with unique potential. Alex, now in 8th grade, stood at the front of the school auditorium, adjusting the microphone. The room was packed with educators from across the state, all gathered for the first annual Educational Equity Conference. Principal Roberts had asked Alex to give the opening speech, sharing his story and its impact on the district's transformation. A year ago, Alex began, his voice steady despite his nerves. I was afraid to raise my hand in class. Today, I'm helping develop teaching materials that will be used in schools across the state. But this isn't just my story. It's about how one moment of standing up for what's right can create waves of positive change. In the audience, he could see familiar faces. Mr. Chen sat with his advanced mathematics class, who were preparing to showcase their own educational games inspired by Alex's original design. Michael and Lily, still his closest friends, were there with the Student Diversity Advisory Board, which had grown to include representatives from every grade level. What happened in Mrs. Thompson's class was painful, Alex continued, but what happened afterwards showed me something important. When we face problems honestly and work together to solve them, real change is possible. He gestured to the side of the stage, where a table displayed various educational materials. These teaching tools weren't created just by teachers. They were developed with student input, making sure every voice is heard and every learning style is respected. In the back of the room, Mrs. Thompson sat quietly. She was now leading the district's teacher training program on inclusive education, using her own journey of transformation to help other educators recognize and address their biases. Her curriculum guide, which included Alex's case study, had been adopted by several neighboring school districts. The probability game I created, Alex explained, has evolved into something bigger than I ever imagined. Teachers across the district are now encouraging students to design their own educational tools. When we give students the freedom to learn and teach in ways that make sense to them, amazing things happen. He clicked to the next slide, showing photographs of elementary school students using various mathematical games. These were created by 6th graders who'd struggled with math. When they were given the chance to approach problems creatively, they didn't just solve them, they found new ways to help others understand them too. In the front row, Alex's parents beamed with pride. His father had joined the school board, working to ensure that policies promoted equality and inclusion. His mother had started a parent advocacy group that helped families navigate the education system and speak up when they saw problems. But the biggest change, Alex continued, isn't in the programs or policies, it's in how we see each other. Every student who walks through those doors now knows they have the right to be heard, to be challenged, and to be supported. He gestured to the Student Diversity Advisory Board members. These students aren't just participating in meetings, they're actively shaping how our school works. They review teaching materials, provide feedback on new policies, and make sure every student's perspective is considered. Principal Roberts stepped forward to join Alex at the podium. What Alex isn't telling you, he added with a smile, is that his mathematical teaching games are now being published as part of our district's official curriculum. His approach to making complex concepts accessible has changed how we think about teaching. After the conference, as people mingled in the hallway, a young student approached Alex. "I started here this year," she said shyly. "My old school. It wasn't always nice to people who looked different. But here, it's like everyone really cares about helping each other learn." That evening, Alex sat in Mr. Chen's classroom, helping him organize materials for the next day's lesson. "You know," Mr. Chen said, "when you first transferred to my class, I saw a student who'd been hurt, but hadn't been broken. Now I see a leader who's helping build something important." Alex looked around the classroom, taking in the walls covered with student projects, each one representing a different way of understanding mathematics. "Sometimes I think about that first day in Mrs. Thompson's class," he admitted. "How different things might have been if I'd just stayed quiet." "It's the least I can do," Mrs. Thompson replied. "Alex, your strength in standing up to unfair treatment didn't just force me to face my biases, it's helping create changes that will benefit countless students in the future." As they left the library that evening, Alex felt a complex mix of emotions. The hurt hadn't completely disappeared, but it was joined by something else: hope, not just for his own future, but for the students who would come after him. His father wrapped an arm around his shoulders as they walked to the car. "You okay, son?" Alex nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think I am. It's weird. I was so afraid of her for so long, but now I just feel, I don't know, kind of proud. Not of what happened, but of what's happening because of it." "You should be proud," his mother added. "Your courage is creating ripples of change. Sometimes the hardest experiences can lead to the most important transformations." Back home, Alex found an email from the district's educational development team. They wanted his input on adapting his probability game for different grade levels and subjects. His approach to teaching mathematics was going to help reshape how teachers engaged with students across the district. As he sat at his desk that night, working on new ideas for educational games, Alex thought about Mrs. Thompson's transformation. It wasn't a fairy tale ending where everything was suddenly perfect, but it was something real and meaningful, proof that when people faced their biases honestly, real change was possible. The district's investigation concluded just as winter was settling in, bringing with it both closure and new beginnings. The findings were clear and comprehensive, leading to decisions that would reshape not just Highland Grove, but the entire school district's approach to education and equality. On a cold December morning, Alex sat with his parents in the district office's main conference room. The walls were lined with educational certificates and student artwork, creating a strange mix of formality and childhood creativity. Across the table sat the superintendent, Principal Roberts, and several board members. The atmosphere was solemn but hopeful. "Before we discuss the official findings," the superintendent began, "I want to thank you, Alex, and your family for your courage in coming forward. Your story has helped us uncover issues that needed addressing for a long time." The investigation had revealed a pattern spanning years. Mrs. Thompson's behavior wasn't just isolated incidents. There were documented cases of bias in her grading, disciplinary actions, and classroom management across multiple schools where she had taught. The evidence was impossible to ignore. "We're implementing immediate changes," Principal Roberts explained, sliding a folder across the table. "Mrs. Thompson will not be returning to classroom teaching. However, she has agreed to undergo extensive professional development and bias training. She's also requested something unexpected. She wants to speak with Alex and his family, if you're willing." Alex felt his parents tense beside him. His father's voice was careful when he spoke. "What exactly does she want to say to our son?" "She's been through an intensive counseling program," the superintendent explained. "The process has led to some significant personal revelations. But of course, it's entirely your choice whether to hear her out. Alex thought about it carefully. The hurt was still there, but something else had grown alongside it, an understanding that people could change if they really wanted to. "I'll talk to her," he said quietly. "But I want my parents and Mr. Chen there too." The meeting was arranged for the following week in the school library after hours. The usually bustling space was quiet, the only sound coming from the old heating system humming in the background. Mrs. Thompson looked different, smaller somehow, without her usual rigid posture and stern expression. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," she began, her voice softer than Alex had ever heard it. "I've spent these past weeks doing a lot of soul-searching and learning. The training and counseling opened my eyes to biases I didn't even realize I had." She pulled out a familiar manila folder, Alex's probability game project. "I sabotaged you," she admitted, "not because your work wasn't excellent, but because it challenged my preconceptions. I couldn't handle the fact that you were exceeding every expectation I had unconsciously placed on you." Alex's mother started to speak, but Mrs. Thompson held up her hand. "Please, let me finish. I'm not here to make excuses. What I did was wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong. I've spent my career thinking I was maintaining high standards, when in reality, I was letting my biases determine who could meet those standards." She turned directly to Alex. "Your game is brilliant. It makes complex concepts accessible and engaging. I've been using my time off to really study it, and I've realized something. This is how mathematics should be taught. You understood that before I did, and my bias prevented me from seeing it." Then she did something unexpected. She pulled out a thick binder. "I've been working with educational consultants to develop a comprehensive guide for teachers about recognizing and addressing bias in mathematics education. Your experience, and my failures, are being used as a case study to help other teachers do better." Alex looked through the binder, surprised to find his game featured prominently as an example of innovative teaching methods. His approaches to problem-solving, which Mrs. Thompson had once dismissed, were now being highlighted as examples of creative mathematical thinking. "I can't undo what I did," Mrs. Thompson continued, her voice thick with emotion. "But I can work to ensure it doesn't happen to other students. I've requested a new position with the district, not as a classroom teacher, but as part of the equity and inclusion training team. I want to share my journey of confronting and overcoming bias with other educators." Mr. Chen, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "That's a brave choice, using your experience to help others change." The letter went on to detail how Alex's case had sparked a district-wide review of teaching practices and policies. Other schools were now implementing similar changes to those at Highland Grove. His story, while painful, had become a catalyst for positive change. As he sat at his desk that night, working on new ideas for educational games, Alex thought about how different things felt now compared to just a few weeks ago. The weight of silence he carried for so long had been replaced by the strength of speaking up, not just for himself, but for others who might face similar situations. Through his window, he could see the lights of other houses in the neighborhood, knowing that in some of them, other students were feeling more hopeful about their place in the school community. The investigation wasn't just about punishing one teacher, it was about building a better system for everyone. His mother knocked softly on his door, bringing him a cup of hot chocolate. "Working on a new game?" she asked, noticing the papers spread across his desk. "Yeah," Alex smiled. "This one's about teaching algebra through storytelling. Mr. Chen thinks it might help students who struggle with abstract concepts." His mother kissed the top of his head, her eyes bright with pride. "You're turning something hard into something helpful. That's real strength." As she left, Alex turned back to his work, energized by the knowledge that change was possible when people worked together. The investigation was still ongoing, but its impact was already clear. Sometimes the biggest problems could lead to the most important solutions. The next few weeks at Highland Grove Middle School felt like watching a slow-motion earthquake, not the destructive kind, but the type that reshapes the landscape into something new and better. The investigation into Mrs. Thompson's behavior uncovered more than anyone had expected, sending ripples through the entire school district. In Mr. Chen's advanced mathematics class, Alex flourished. The difference was like stepping out of a dark room into sunlight. Mr. Chen had a way of making every student feel heard, valued, and challenged in the best possible ways. When Alex raised his hand, he was called on just like anyone else. When he solved problems in creative ways, his methods were celebrated and shared with the class. "Look at this elegant solution," Mr. Chen would say, asking Alex to explain his thinking to his classmates. This is exactly the kind of creative problem-solving mathematicians use in the real world. But the real changes were happening behind the scenes. The district launched a thorough investigation, reviewing years of student records, complaints, and grading patterns. They discovered that Mrs. Thompson's behavior hadn't been limited to Alex. There was a clear pattern of bias against minority students stretching back through her teaching career. One morning, Principal Roberts called an all-school assembly. The large gymnasium filled with students, their whispered conversations creating a soft buzz of anticipation. Alex sat with his new advanced math class, including Michael and Lily, who had become his closest friends. "As many of you know," Principal Roberts began, his voice echoing through the gym, "recent events have forced us to confront some uncomfortable truths about our school community. Today, I want to share with you the changes we're making to ensure every student feels safe, respected, and valued at Highland Grove." He outlined a comprehensive plan that went far beyond just addressing one teacher's behavior. The school would be implementing new anonymous reporting systems for students to safely report discrimination. Teachers would undergo regular training on recognizing and addressing unconscious bias. The curriculum would be reviewed and updated to better reflect diverse perspectives and contributions in every subject. But the most surprising announcement came last. And finally, Principal Roberts said, "I'm pleased to introduce our new Student Diversity Advisory Board. These students will work directly with faculty and administration to ensure we're creating a truly inclusive environment." Alex felt a surge of pride as Michael and Lily stood up alongside other students who had been selected for the board. They had turned their experience of witnessing injustice into a force for positive change. After the assembly, the hallways buzzed with excitement. Students who had never spoken up before began sharing their own stories. A quiet girl from Alex's English class revealed how she'd been afraid to wear her cultural clothing to school. A boy from the soccer team talked about feeling pressured to act less foreign to fit in. The investigation's findings reached the district level, prompting wider discussions about systemic change. School board meetings, usually attended by just a handful of parents, now overflowed with community members wanting to be part of the solution. At one such meeting, Alex's parents were invited to speak. His father stood at the podium, his voice strong and clear. What happened to my son was not just about one teacher or one classroom. It was about a system that allowed bias to go unchecked. But what happened afterward? That shows the power of a community willing to stand up and say, "This is not okay." Back in the classroom, Alex's math game had taken on a life of its own. Elementary school teachers across the district were using it to teach probability concepts. Some had even started asking their students to create their own educational games, inspired by Alex's design. One afternoon, as Alex helped a group of sixth graders learn probability using his game, Mr. Chen watched from the doorway. "You know," he said quietly, "sometimes the best teachers are the ones who've had to overcome the biggest obstacles." The comment stuck with Alex, making him think about his future in a new way. He'd always loved mathematics, but now he was seeing how it could be more than just solving problems on paper. It could be about making learning accessible and enjoyable for everyone. At home that evening, Alex found a letter in the mail from the district superintendent. Opening it with trembling fingers, he read the first line. "Your courage in speaking up has helped us identify and address systemic issues affecting students across our district." "That's a start," Alex's father said. "But what about the other students? The ones who might be too scared to speak up?" "Actually," Mr. Chen spoke up again, "the students have already started something. Michael and Lily are organizing a student diversity council. They've asked Alex to join, if he's willing." For the first time that day, Alex felt a small smile tug at his lips. His classmates hadn't just noticed what was happening. They'd stood up against it, documented it, and were working to prevent it from happening to anyone else. "There's one more thing," Principal Roberts added, reaching for Alex's project. "This math game, it's exceptional work. With your permission, I'd like to share it with our elementary school teachers. Something like this could really help younger students understand probability concepts." As they left the principal's office, Alex noticed a crowd had gathered in the hallway, students from his class, including Michael and Lily, waiting to show their support. The sight made his throat tight with emotion. He'd spent weeks thinking he was alone, but it turned out he'd had allies all along. They'd just been gathering evidence, building their case, waiting for the right moment to stand up together. Walking out of school that day, with his parents beside him and his project finally recognized for its true worth, Alex understood something important. Sometimes fighting injustice wasn't about facing it alone, it was about building a community strong enough to stand against it together. And tomorrow, when he walked into Mr. Chen's advanced math class, he would hold his head high, knowing he had helped create that very community. Principal Roberts' office felt smaller than usual with 6 people crowded inside. Alex sat between his parents on a worn leather couch, his mathematics project still clutched protectively in his arms. Mrs. Thompson perched stiffly in a chair near the window, while Mr. Chen, the science teacher, stood quietly by the door. Behind his large oak desk, Principal Roberts adjusted his reading glasses, looking at the laptop screen before him. "What I'm about to show you," he began, his voice carefully measured, "was uploaded to the school's social media page about 30 minutes ago." He turned the laptop around, and Alex recognized the scene immediately. It was his presentation from earlier that morning. In the video, which had clearly been recorded by one of his classmates, every interruption, every dismissive comment, and every accusation from Mrs. Thompson played out in crystal clear quality. But it wasn't just today's incident. The video was a compilation. There were clips from other classes. Alex's raised hand being ignored, his correct answers being questioned, the seating arrangement that kept him isolated. The students put this together. Alex's mother asked, her voice tight with emotion. Several students, it seems, Principal Roberts replied, led by Michael Chen and Lily Parker. They've been documenting incidents for the past few weeks. Mrs. Thompson shifted in her chair. Those phones should have been confiscated. It's against school policy to record. Given the circumstances, Principal Roberts interrupted firmly. I think we have more pressing concerns than phone policy. He turned to Alex. Son, I want you to know that you're not in any trouble. Can you tell us, in your own words, what's been happening in Mrs. Thompson's class? Alex looked at his parents, who nodded encouragingly. Taking a deep breath, he began to speak. He told them everything. The first day with the pencil incident, the constant interruptions, the higher standards he was held to, the way his contributions were always questioned or dismissed. As he spoke, his father's hand tightened on his shoulder, and his mother wiped quiet tears from her eyes. And this project, Alex continued, finally opening the manila folder. I worked really hard on it. I can explain every part, every calculation. I even have all my rough drafts and notes. He spread the materials across Principal Roberts' desk, pages of handwritten calculations, early designs, and test results from when he tried the game with different players. Mr. Chen stepped forward. If I may, sir, I've seen Alex working on this during lunch periods. Several students have mentioned to me how he helped them understand probability concepts through his game design. It's quite impressive work. Principal Roberts examined the materials carefully, then turned to Mrs. Thompson. Do you have anything to say about this? Mrs. Thompson's face had grown pale. I was simply maintaining high academic standards if some students felt I was being too strict. Too strict. Alex's father spoke for the first time, his voice controlled but firm. My son has been systematically discriminated against in your classroom. The evidence is right there on that screen. I would never, Mrs. Thompson began, but Principal Roberts held up his hand. The video speaks for itself, Patricia, but more importantly, other teachers and students have come forward with similar observations. This isn't about strict standards. This is about bias, whether conscious or unconscious. The principal turned back to Alex and his parents. I want to apologize on behalf of Highland Grove. This should never have happened, and we failed to notice it sooner. I assure you this will be addressed appropriately. What does that mean exactly? Alex's mother asked, her voice steady despite her tears. Because my son has been carrying this burden alone for weeks, thinking he couldn't tell us, thinking he had to prove himself worthy of basic respect. Principal Roberts nodded gravely. Effective immediately, Mrs. Thompson will be placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. Alex will be transferred to Mr. Chen's advanced mathematics section. His test scores more than qualify him. And we'll be implementing mandatory sensitivity and bias training for all staff members. She turned to Alex, her expression unreadable. It seems the principal would like to see us both immediately. As they walked through the eerily quiet hallway, Alex noticed small groups of students watching them pass, whispering behind their hands. Near the water fountain, he saw Michael and Lily talking intently with Mr. Chen, the young science teacher who had always been kind to him. The walk to the principal's office felt like it took hours, though it was only down 2 corridors. Alex's mind raced. Had someone reported what happened? Would anyone believe him over Mrs. Thompson? Would this make everything worse? Just before they reached the office, he saw his parents through the glass window of the main office, his father still in his work suit, his mother clutching her purse with white knuckles. Their eyes met his, full of concern and determination. As the principal's door opened, Alex realized that everything was about to change. The truth he'd been trying to protect his parents from, the situation he'd been trying to handle on his own, it was all about to come out. And somehow, standing there with his ruined project in his arms, but his head held high, he felt ready. Whatever happened next, he wouldn't face it alone. The next morning dawned with an unusual chill for early autumn. Alex walked into Highland Grove Middle School, clutching a thick manila folder, his mathematics project that had taken him 3 weeks to complete. The assignment was to create an original math game that could teach younger students about probability and statistics. He'd stayed up late many nights, designing colorful cards and writing clear instructions, even testing the game with his younger cousin to make sure it was both fun and educational. The hallways buzzed with nervous energy as students prepared to present their projects. Alex noticed several of his classmates had created simple board games or modified versions of popular card games. His project was different. He'd designed an interactive game that used both cards and dice, with multiple levels of difficulty that could adapt to different learning styles. As he set up his materials at his desk, he overheard snippets of conversation from his classmates. "Did you see what happened in Mr. Chen's class? Yeah, he lets everyone present their projects however they want. So different from Mrs. Thompson." The classroom fell silent as Mrs. Thompson entered, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor. "Good morning, class," she announced, adjusting her glasses. "Today's presentations should take no more than 3 minutes each. Remember, clarity and simplicity are key." One by one, students presented their projects. Mrs. Thompson nodded approvingly at most presentations, offering constructive feedback and occasional praise. "Very creative use of dice, Thomas. Excellent explanation of probability, Rachel." When it was Alex's turn, he walked to the front of the room with confidence. This was his chance to show everyone what he could do. He began setting up his game board, carefully arranging the custom cards he'd created. "Alexander," Mrs. Thompson's voice cut through his concentration. "What is all this?" "It's my math game, Mrs. Thompson," Alex replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's called Probability Path. Players use cards and dice toe." "The assignment was to create a simple game," she interrupted, her voice sharp. "This looks far too complicated. Did someone help you with this?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Alex felt his cheeks grow hot, but he stood his ground. "No, ma'am. I designed it myself. I can show you how it works." "I'd find it hard to believe a student at your level could create something this elaborate without outside help," Mrs. Thompson continued, walking closer to inspect the materials. "These cards look professionally made." "I used my computer to design them," Alex explained. "My dad helped me print them at his office, but I did all the work myself. I can explain every part." Mrs. Thompson picked up one of the cards, examining it with obvious skepticism. "And these probability calculations, where did you get these from?" "I worked them out," Alex said, his voice growing smaller. "I used the formulas we learned in class and—" "Enough," Mrs. Thompson cut him off again. "I've been teaching mathematics for 20 years, Alexander. I know when a student is trying to pass off others' work as their own. Please take your seat." The silence in the classroom was deafening. Alex stood frozen, his carefully created game pieces scattered across the desk. In the back of the room, someone's phone made a soft clicking sound, the sound of a video being stopped. "But Mrs. Thompson," a voice spoke up from the middle of the classroom. It was Michael. "We all saw Alex working on this during lunch breaks. He showed us his drafts and everything." "Yeah," Lily added, her voice trembling slightly but determined. "He even tested it with different people to make sure it worked properly." Mrs. Thompson's face hardened. "I don't recall asking for comments from the class. Alexander, take your seat now. We'll discuss this after class." But something had shifted in the room. As Alex gathered his materials, hands shaking slightly, other students began to murmur. Someone in the back row stood up and walked out, laptop clutched to their chest. Another student pulled out their phone, fingers flying across the screen. "I said quiet." Mrs. Thompson's voice rose sharply. "The next person who speaks out of turn will join Alexander in detention." The rest of the class period passed in tense silence. When the bell rang, no one rushed to leave as they usually did. Instead, several students lingered, watching as Alex slowly packed up his game, carefully placing each handmade card back into its envelope. "My office." "Now," Mrs. Thompson commanded, leading Alex toward the door. But before they could leave, the classroom phone rang. Mrs. Thompson answered it, her face changing as she listened. "Yes, Principal Roberts, right now." "But I have a disciplinary issue too." "Yes, sir, I understand. We'll be right there." That evening, as Alex worked on his homework at the kitchen table, his mother noticed something different about his posture, a slight straightening of his shoulders, a return of the spark in his eyes that had been dimming over the past weeks. "Good day at school?" she asked casually, stirring a pot of her famous chili. Alex paused, pencil hovering over his math homework. For the first time in weeks, he felt ready to share a little of what had been happening. "Mom," he started slowly, "what do you do when someone important, like a teacher, doesn't like you, no matter what you do?" His mother's stirring slowed to a stop. She pulled out a chair and sat down beside him, her eyes full of understanding and concern. "Has something been happening at school that I should know about?" As Alex began to explain, carefully choosing his words, he didn't notice his father standing in the doorway, listening intently, his expression growing more concerned with each word. The story was finally coming out, but none of them realized that tomorrow would bring an incident that would make it impossible for anyone to ignore the situation any longer. The pot of chili simmered on the stove, forgotten, as Alex's parents exchanged worried glances over their son's head. They had hoped moving to this neighborhood would give their son better opportunities, not teach him such harsh lessons about prejudice at such a young age. But as they listened to their son's story, they began to realize that sometimes the most important lessons aren't found in any textbook. As weeks passed at Highland Grove Middle School, the subtle signs became impossible to ignore. Every morning, Alex would arrive early, determined to prove himself in Mrs. Thompson's class. And every morning, it seemed like he was trying to catch smoke with his bare hands. The pattern started small, like water dripping from a barely loose faucet. During class discussions, Alex's raised hand would hover in the air until his arm ached, while Mrs. Thompson called on every other student around him. When he finally got a chance to speak, she'd often cut him off mid-sentence with a curt, "That's enough," or moving on, even when he was making the same points as his classmates. One particularly frustrating morning, Alex solved a complex algebra problem faster than anyone else in class. Instead of praise, Mrs. Thompson's response cut through the air like ice. "Well, it seems someone's been looking ahead in the textbook. Remember, Alexander, it's not about being first, it's about understanding the process." Alex wanted to explain that he hadn't cheated, math just made sense to him, like his own native language. But the words stuck in his throat as he noticed a few students snickering behind their hands. Next to him, Lily shot him a sympathetic glance, but even she had learned to keep quiet after their first day incident. During group work, other students would subtly shift their desks away from his, not out of personal dislike, but because they'd noticed how Mrs. Thompson seemed to find fault with any group that included him. "Your group seems distracted today," she'd say, hovering over them with a disapproving frown. The message was clear, though never spoken aloud. At home, the weight of it all started showing in small ways. His mother noticed how he'd lost his appetite for her famous Sunday pancakes. His father caught him staring blankly at his homework, the usually beloved math problems untouched. But whenever they asked, Alex would force a smile and say everything was fine. After all, what could he tell them? That his teacher never quite looked him in the eye? That she marked his work harder than others? That she always seemed to find him disruptive even when he sat quietly taking notes? One day, while working on a group project about famous mathematicians, Alex's group was assigned George Washington Carver. As they prepared their presentation, Alex discovered that besides being known for his agricultural innovations, Carver had also been a talented artist who'd used his mathematical skills in his paintings. Excited by this connection between math and art, Alex spent hours preparing his part of the presentation, even creating a small demonstration of how Carver used geometric principles in his work. The morning of the presentation, he arrived early to set up, his heart pounding with anticipation. As other groups presented, Mrs. Thompson was all smiles and encouraging nods. But when Alex's group took their turn, her demeanor shifted. She interrupted repeatedly, questioning every fact, even though Alex had triple-checked everything in the school library. "Are you sure about these dates?" she asked, her voice tripping with doubt. "And where exactly did you find this information about his mathematical contributions? It seems rather creative." Alex stood his ground, politely citing his sources, including books from the school library. But Mrs. Thompson wasn't finished. "It's important to stick to well-known facts, Alexander. We wouldn't want to mislead the class with exaggerations." The final blow came when she added, "Perhaps next time you should choose a more conventional mathematician to study." That afternoon, something unexpected happened. During lunch break, a small group of students approached Alex's usually empty table. Leading them was Michael, a quiet boy who usually sat near the front of the class. "Hey," Michael said, sliding into the seat across from Alex. "What Mrs. Thompson did today, it wasn't right. We all saw how much work you put into that presentation." "Yeah," added another student, placing her lunch tray down. "And you actually made mathematics sound interesting. I didn't know about the art connection at all." Alex felt a warmth spreading in his chest, the first real warmth he felt at school in weeks. As they talked, more students joined the table, and for the first time, Alex felt less alone. They shared stories about other times they'd noticed Mrs. Thompson's behavior and how uncomfortable it made them feel. "Cheating will not be tolerated in my classroom," she began. "But we weren't," Alex tried to explain, but Mrs. Thompson held up her hand. "I saw what I saw. You'll both receive 0 grades for today's assessment." She paused, then added, looking directly at Alex, "I suggest you come better prepared tomorrow, Alexander. This isn't the kind of school where you can expect others to provide for you." The words hit him like a physical blow. As they left the classroom, the girl, who introduced herself as Lily, apologized profusely. "That wasn't fair at all," she whispered. "You should tell someone." But Alex just shook his head, his grandfather's words echoing in his mind. "Sometimes you've got to be twice as good to get half as far." He hadn't understood what that meant until now, standing in this hallway, holding a pencil that had somehow cost him his first grade in middle school. That evening, as Alex sat at his desk at home, staring at his math homework, his mother noticed his unusual quietness. "How was your first day, sweetheart?" she asked, sitting on the edge of his bed. He wanted to tell her everything about the cold greeting, the back corner desk, the pencil incident, the 0 grade. But he also remembered how hard his parents had worked to move to this neighborhood for its better educational opportunities. Instead, he forced a smile and said, "It was fine, Mom, just getting used to a new school." But as he lay in bed that night, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. He clutched his grandfather's mechanical pencil, running his fingers over the worn grip, and made a silent promise to himself. He wouldn't let anyone, not even Mrs. Thompson, stop him from proving what he could do. Tomorrow would be different. It had to be. Little did he know, tomorrow would bring challenges that would test not just his mathematical abilities, but his strength of character in ways he never could have imagined. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees as students hurried into Highland Grove Middle School, their excitement for the new academic year filling the hallways with animated chatter and laughter. Among them was a 12-year-old boy named Alex, his brand new backpack slung over his shoulders and a determined smile on his face. This would be his first year at a new school, and despite being one of the few black students in this predominantly white institution, he was determined to make his mark. as he walked through the corridor, searching for room 207. Alex's mind wandered to his parents' words from that morning. "Remember, son," his father had said, adjusting Alex's collar with gentle hands, "your intelligence is your superpower. Never let anyone dim your light." His mother had added, pulling him into a warm hug, "And you call us if anything doesn't feel right, anything at all." Alex hadn't quite understood their concern then. After all, he'd always been a star student, particularly in mathematics. Numbers were his friends, reliable, consistent, and beautifully logical. They never judged, never played favorites. In his old school, even the 8th graders would come to him for help with their math homework. Room 207 appeared before him, its door propped open with a worn wooden doorstop. Alex took a deep breath and stepped inside. The classroom was already half full, students clustering in small groups, catching up on summer stories. The walls were covered with inspirational posters about grammar rules and mathematical formulas, all carefully laminated and precisely aligned. At the front of the room stood Mrs. Thompson, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose as she organized papers on her desk. She looked up as Alex entered, and something flickered across her face, so quick he almost missed it. Was it surprise? Disappointment? He couldn't quite tell, but the warmth in her voice seemed forced as she said, "You must be Alexander Harris." "Yes, ma'am." Alex replied politely, his father's lessons in respectfulness automatically kicking in. "But everyone calls me Alex." "We'll stick with Alexander," Mrs. Thompson said curtly, consulting her seating chart. "Take the desk in the back corner, please." Alex's heart sank a little as he made his way to the assigned seat, the back corner, about as far from the teacher's desk as possible. Still, he told himself, maybe it would be good to have a view of the whole classroom. He could see everything from here, including the whiteboard, though he'd have to squint a bit to make out the smaller writing. As other students filed in, Mrs. Thompson greeted each one by name, her smile growing progressively warmer. "Katie, lovely to see you again. How's your big sister doing in high school? And James, I had your brother 2 years ago. I hope you're as good at algebra as he was." The personal touches made Alex's own reception feel even colder in comparison. The first class began with a math assessment to determine everyone's skill level. Alex's spirits lifted. This was his chance to show what he could do. As Mrs. Thompson distributed the papers, he pulled out his lucky mechanical pencil, the one his grandfather had given him before passing away last year. "No mechanical pencils," Mrs. Thompson's sharp voice cut through his thoughts. "Number 2 pencils only, Alexander." She was already moving on to the next row as Alex quietly put away his pencil, his cheeks burning as he heard a few snickers from nearby students. He raised his hand, hoping to ask for a regular pencil since he hadn't brought one, but Mrs. Thompson's eyes swept past him as if he were invisible. A girl sitting 2 seats away noticed his dilemma and discreetly rolled a pencil toward him. He caught it with a grateful smile, but before he could even pick it up, Mrs. Thompson's voice rang out again. "Alexander, no passing items during a test. See me after class." The girl started to speak up, but Mrs. Thompson, "I was just—" "That's enough," Mrs. Thompson cut her off. "Both of you can see me after class." Alex's hand trembled slightly as he picked up the pencil, but he forced himself to focus on the test. This was familiar territory: equations, word problems, geometric patterns. As he worked through each question, the numbers danced in his mind, falling into place like pieces of a puzzle. Despite the rocky start, he finished the assessment with time to spare, double-checking each answer carefully. When the bell rang, the other students rushed out while Alex and the kind girl who'd tried to help him stayed behind. Mrs. Thompson looked at them sternly over her glasses.